Ukraine's President Zelensky, pushed to do so by Keir Starmer and other European allies, has sent Donald Trump a letter saying that Ukraine is ready for peace, will accept Trump's leadership in this process, and will embrace a ceasefire. In my view, this is Zelensky walking into a trap that will end in a deal that suits Vladimir Putin being pushed onto Ukraine in a way that will be nearly impossible to resist. Let's go through what are the signals in plain sight suggesting that that's the case. First of all, the European partners to Zelensky are still, as I've observed here before, clinging to the view that Trump may be erratic, but nevertheless he is intending to negotiate with the Russians on Ukraine's behalf. And of course they say Ukraine should be at the table as well, and Europe too, pretty please, but that's their starting assumption. And as I've argued here for the last week, it's an assumption that doesn't fit the recent facts and behaviours. Nevertheless, if that's their view of the situation, then what Starmer has been seeking to persuade Zelensky to do, and you could assume this would be happening, but it's since been attested to by a story in The Telegraph, is to play along with the proposal in the belief that Russia has no intention of doing likewise, and so will be exposed as the real barrier to peace. There's a story about how Britain did just this at one point in the build-up to the Falklands War. America had then come up with a peace proposal that British Prime Minister thought should be utterly rejected, out of hand. But rather than doing that, they just asked the Americans if the Argentinians had agreed to the proposal. So they asked, and the Argentine junta duly rejected the idea, and so it just went away without blame being attached to Britain. That is what they assume here. They assume Putin still wants his maximalist goals, which that at least is an assumption that does fit the facts. Therefore, if Zelensky embraces the Trump administration's peace process, Trump will soon discover that Putin doesn't want to play ball, and this will then be exposed to the world. Rather than blaming Ukraine and Zelensky, Trump will then understand the real issue and restore at least some support for Ukraine as the struggle continues. But none of that does fit the facts. For a start, it assumes good faith negotiations. Trump's team negotiated with the Russians in Riyadh, and it was all about mutual benefit for America and Russia, first and foremost. Trump's America is already taking steps to normalise relations with Russia, appointing ambassadors, looking forward to lifting sanctions. The dynamic that fits the facts is one that I've described here before. Trump is negotiating with Putin on his own behalf, and Ukraine is just a piece on the board. It's not the object of the game. Now, thanks to the urging of his European allies, who still want to believe that the old world order applies, Zelensky is walking into the trap. He will sign America's minerals deal, which hands over the value of half of Ukraine's natural wealth to a current adversary, which I think is a damn shame. I mean, you can argue, and validly, that there should be, over a period of time, a way for Ukraine to give value back to the countries that financially supported it, and one of those, yes, was America. But this one-sided deal was created by people who never gave a thing to Ukraine. It is attached to lies that were repeated, again most recently in Trump's joint Congress speech, of inflated figures of support that America is supposed to have given to Ukraine. It is being sold as a security guarantee in its own right, which Zelensky has highlighted, to his cost obviously, but it is simply not. And it is almost certainly designed to extract far more than is fair, even while the current administration sells out the interests of Ukraine to its mortal enemy. Like I say, a damn shame. But this is the price of attempting to call Putin's bluff. What we heard in Trump's big speech last night, Nothing strategic about his completely different approach to foreign affairs, no surprise there, but we heard him say, in the vaguest possible of terms, that Putin had sent him signals that he was ready to talk peace. Well, of course he is. It's almost painful hearing some of the commentators speculating, how serious might Putin be? Will he now be prepared to seriously compromise? Blah, 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 blah. Instead, Ukraine signs the deal, accepts Trump's so-called leadership. Trump then has his summit with Putin. They agree between themselves what's going to happen. I expect Trump will ask something from Putin that he can present as a concession, but it will nevertheless be a position that is unacceptable to Ukraine and, by and large, to Europe. Then the pressure will be applied to Ukraine to accept the deal in the name of peace. Russia will give America many benefits in exchange for that scenario. We've seen them in the last day offering to mediate with Iran on nuclear weapons on behalf of Trump. Interestingly, it's reported that the Iranian leadership, having seen what happened in the Oval Office last Friday, actively don't want to talk to Trump. They have no interest in exposing themselves to such an aggressive, ridiculous process. Now, that may or may not be where it ends, but it wouldn't be a surprise, particularly amongst all the cultures of the world where saving face is a high priority in all dealings. Many leaders are not going to be queuing up for a session like that in the Oval Office. So that's one thing Russia is already doing for Trump. And it's also been noted that Russian state media is sharply changing its tune. On Sunday, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was listing all the evils of the various European countries, but not America. And he said this: if we look at history in retrospect, the Americans did not play any instigating, let alone incendiary role. Not what he was saying just a few weeks ago. Alexei Zhuravlyov, who has been notable for threatening the United States with nuclear annihilation, as you do, was telling Russian viewers last week that Russia could make friends with America after all. And he said this: Trump needs us. Do we need Trump? We do. Do our interests coincide? They do. Against whom? Against the European Union. But now those dastardly Europeans have pushed Zelensky to sign the minerals deal and allowed Trump the trust to speak to Vladimir Putin allegedly on Ukraine's behalf. Arguably, Europe is mostly playing for time. The assumption is that the United States will do progressively less in Europe, which will require European nations to step up, and they can do that on an accelerated timetable, but it's still quite a long timetable. In reality, it has to be. So if the US pulled out abruptly, it would be likely disastrous for Ukraine and a crisis for Europe as a whole. Hence why you should expect that the process leading up to Zelensky's letter to Trump included a lot of consultation with those people, a bunch of calls between Britain and France with officials in the Trump administration, with those officials being asked, what would it take to get Zelensky back into this process? What does he have to do for Trump to be satisfied? These discussions are the standard glue of diplomacy, and the answer being, in this case, sign up to the minerals deal straight away, bend the knee to Trump, embrace an immediate ceasefire. They probably didn't add that he should then not squeal as the reality of betrayal sets in. That bit will come soon enough. For the Europeans, this seems no big deal, and they expect that it will then get the Americans focused on whether Russia will accept a ceasefire, and when they don't, the penny will drop who the real problem is, as we've discussed. This is either the willful blindness of desperation, or the recognition that even if it is a trap, it's better that the trap be sprung and the world see it for what it is. Because, let's face it, for Trump and for Putin, the trap works, whether Zelensky steps into it or not. At least if he steps into it, the betrayal becomes visible. If he doesn't, he and Ukraine easily get blamed for the war continuing. It's not much of an argument. It vastly underrates the MAGA world's ability to blame the victim under all circumstances and whatever flimsy arguments and fake evidence comes to hand, but this is the game. From the three-stage deal that was reportedly floated in the US-Russia summit in Riyadh, one might suggest that what will happen next is that Russia will agree to the ceasefire, with or without some conditions, depending how impatient they are. Then will come the concerted pressure on Ukraine to hold elections, now that there's a ceasefire. That was the plan. Get Zelensky off the board, someone who's newer and hopefully more manipulable into his place, preferably an out-and-out Putin puppet. That may be tough given current sentiment in Ukraine. Now, it may or may not work. It could be the point where blame gets reattached to Ukraine simply for refusing to stick its neck obligingly onto the chopping block. And then after that point will come the big reveal of the terms of surrender, the peace plan. This will then create the crisis point. How much resolve will the war-weary Ukrainians retain once the fighting has been stopped for a few months? Will those European allies, who know how exposed they themselves are in the face of this more aggressive world, how much will they encourage the Ukrainians to reject an unequal deal? Sam Friedman of the Institute for Government, writing on his Substack, highlighted for me the hallucination that is sustaining the European end on all of this. Having talked about why it made sense for Zelensky to sign up for an immediate truce, he then discussed the risks that will come from the peace negotiation process itself. And he said this: another risk is that proposals emerging out of the US-Russian dialogue would be left untested with Ukraine and gain unwarranted traction. In the end, if Trump really wants a deal, then he needs Ukraine's agreement. This is the sort of reasoning that fails to engage with current evidence. It assumes that Trump is primarily motivated by getting the deal that magically strikes the right notes, gets Russia and Ukraine both embracing it, and if he doesn't get that, then he will be frustrated in what he wants. Silly old Donald. So, let me ask the question. Trump could easily have asked Denmark to have more US security based on Greenland and to have access to minerals there. They would have said yes. Instead, he started bullying and threatening them because he wants sole ownership of the country. How is Trump seeking to get what he wants from Mexico, from Canada, from the EU? This is what fits the facts. Trump respects power, he treats Putin and Xi Jinping accordingly, he despises every country that is, in his mind, too weak to count. Those he bullies to get what he wants as a matter of first preference. In what universe wouldn't that suggest to you that he will strike a deal with Putin where he gives Putin what he wants on Ukraine in return for other benefits to the United States, and then he will seek to bully Ukraine into accepting the unequal deal? How can you look at the last few weeks and say there's even any doubt on that score? Now, it may be that Trump's attempts at bullying fail. Ukrainians have already displayed a courage and resilience that falls outside his terms of understanding. It may be that the deal doesn't stick and Putin resumes the war just because he still does harbour his maximalist goals and he knows that the US won't oppose him. And they'll find a way that Ukraine will still get the blame because every aggressive dictator that ever invaded another country came up with some bullshit excuse that they claim justified their actions. There's a scene in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo where the hero realises who the murderer is, just as aforementioned murderer invites him in for a cup of tea and a chat. And he agrees. When he wakes up imprisoned in the murderer's dungeon, the murderer asks him, "You knew it was a trap, and yet you came anyway. Why? For fear of giving offence?" It's a telling reflection, Because logically, you can rationalize it like this. It was the gulf between the realization that logic was telling you you were now in a dangerous environment and the desire, fed by the mundane normality of an invitation for a cup of tea, to believe that actually the normal world still applies. Nothing's changed, in spite of the evidence, in spite of what your brain is telling you. President Trump has invited Ukraine's Zelensky in for a cup of tea. Zelensky knows it's a trap, but Keir Starmer and his other allies have persuaded him that he should accept anyway. 'Cause probably it's just a nice cup of tea, maybe. Zelensky's rude awakening will be an equally sharp rude awakening in due course for those allies, particularly for Britain. This was Britain's recently departed US Ambassador Karen Pierce talking to the Times of London about the much vaunted US-UK special relationship. She said this: "I think it is in Americans' interests. They're not sentimental about it." No kidding. We are America's truly global ally. We are both reliable and capable, and we have what we would call global reach, and a day one, night one ally. We're ready to go, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with America in a whole range of ventures. At what point, you have to wonder, will that change? Keir Starmer is making it the hill to die on. But as the projects that America embarks upon become increasingly at odds with any values Britain would aspire to, like bullying Denmark to take over Greenland, at what point will Keir Starmer say, enough, now we have to stand apart? And what will have happened to Ukraine by the time we finally get to that stage? And will the UK have allowed its own reputation to become as sullied as the Trump administration's America is becoming on the world stage by the time we get there?